Leticia.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with the recording. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Elena and Rani, for the invitation. I was positively surprised when we got your email because the paper had just been out, and I'm very excited to be able to speak with you all. I was told that both faculty and students would be invited, so I think some of what I say might be known to some of you, but bear with me, and I hope we can have an interesting discussion afterwards. So I'm going to talk about some practical guidance for applying co-production of knowledge in research projects. And as Elena already mentioned, this is based on a research paper to which I'm the first author, and then Maiken, Bjørkan, and Brigt are co-authors. And the story of this paper is that, yeah, we work a lot with the co-production here at the Nordland Research Institute, and we were just commenting on some experiences we've had in common across very different projects, and we thought, well, shouldn't we write a paper about it? And this is the result. And yeah, it's a bit unorthodox in the sense that it's a kind of an essay where we reflect, but we also come upon some, we wanted to have some practical guidance, and this is what I'm going to introduce to you now. So what is co-production of knowledge? So we based our thoughts on another paper from 2020, Nordstrom and colleagues, that's published in Nature Sustainability, where they define co-production as an iterative and collaborative process involving diverse types of expertise, knowledge, and actors to produce context-specific knowledge. And in that paper, they come about principles of co-production. That's what the paper is about. And yeah, so there are 4 things, and the very title co-production already tells you that it has to do with participation, context-based, pluralistic, goal-oriented, and so on. But what they don't really say is, how do you go about it? Because there are many terms and titles, as you can see here in the light bulb, right? We talk a lot about citizen participation. In the European Union Horizon 2020 projects, they talk about the multi-actor approach. We hear about citizen science, all sorts of experts. So what is it? How do these terms come together, and what is co-production of knowledge? And more than that, how do we make it a practice in our projects? So just before I come with our ideas on what's important to keep in mind, yeah, why co-production of knowledge? And we're based on the idea that we're living in the post-normal age. And in the past edition of this seminar, we had Silvio Funtovitz, who is the father of post-normal science. But just to recap a little bit, there are different views on post-normal science. One is the empirical view, which is just a recognition that for some problems, you cannot just neatly divide what's a fact and what's a value. Whether you want it or not, these things are intertwined. And it also reflects a bit the fact that we have a kind of industrialization of the scientific enterprise, in that people do research for very concrete problems and they want solutions immediately, both for the sake of innovations and technology development, but also for policy advice. And then we have the normative view, which says that research and science should be conducted in partnership with the civil society and other actors than scientists. So it's about social justice and inclusion, democracy, and it implies a different social contract between science and society. And then the third one is a more instrumental view, which is the fact that practice experts have access to unique data sets, unique perspectives, unique knowledge that can enrich what scientists do. But regardless of what people believe or where they come from, whether it's about noticing this is the case or advocating for a greater engagement with civil society, we need a method to do science in the post-normal age. And that method, among other things, and several tools, is what we're calling co-production of knowledge. And I want to give an example of a post-normal problem in which I have done some research in myself, which is marine litter. So why is marine litter something that embodies the post-normal condition? Yeah, it's a problem of immediate consequence. The problem of plastic or whatever litter disturbs marine life and ecosystems. It has also an impact in human health, so the quality of fish biomass, for instance, and all sorts of economic activities that have to do with the ocean, not just fisheries. Of course, fisheries is a very prominent activity that's impacted by marine litter, but also shipping, when nets, for instance, get entangled in propellers of ships, that can be a problem. But of course, also tourism. No one wants to visit a littered beach. So it's difficult to pinpoint a specific source of litter, both when you talk about a geographical source, but also a specific actor. We know by, of course, looking at fish nets that fisheries has an impact, but it's also difficult to say sometimes if this waste is recent or if it has been there for decades or when exactly it has been thrown off board. And yeah, another issue is that marine litter challenges social political boundaries. So you can have a piece of litter that has been discarded just anywhere else, but because of ocean currents ends up in the Arctic. So if you put on measures only in Norway, you might not solve the entire problem with marine litter. You need supranational coordination and, of course, coordination across disciplines. You need oceanography, biology, but also, of course, sociology, anthropology, economics, and all sorts of experts have a stake in this problem. Many other problems, especially when we're talking about sustainability, which I'm more familiar, but I would suppose also health and other interests share this kind of characteristics where you have facts, of course, but you also have values that influence what choices are made in both research, but also in measures to address this problem. And that's what we're discussing in terms of post-normal science. And why do we argue that there's a need for guidance when it comes to researchers and scientists and just anyone participating in this kind of transdisciplinary projects? Well, we know by experience that just putting people together in a room is not sufficient for a collaborative result, right? You have to address that people have different worldviews and worries, but also different ways of talking about things, different things that they want to accomplish and that interest them. The other issue is that, of course, many scientists, and I'll discuss more of this later today, is that sometimes they're oblivious or reluctant to engage with what the social political consequences of their work are. They want to be in the comfort of their expertise and not in the discomfort of telling people how to solve the problem. A third issue is the fact that scientists, all scientists, but especially early career scientists, they need support in the soft skills of project management. I know very few people who had learned those skills in their PhDs. But then when you begin working as a scientist, you have to not only learn how to apply for funding, but also how to coordinate these large-scale applications with all sorts of actors, with NGOs and governments, municipalities, ministries, colleagues from other disciplines. That can be very challenging. And then we have the issue that we need some guidance because we want to avoid that co-production becomes just a bureaucratic box-checking exercise. Well, the European Union asks for it, let's say we're using it, but we need it to be more impactful than that. And of course, we don't want co-production to give an appearance of participation where this isn't the case. We want it to be meaningful collaboration between experts of different origins. And that's the motivation we had for writing this paper, right? But we have some considerations that I think is important to make explicit. And the first is that, well, stakeholders and experts, there's an overlap there, but not all stakeholders are experts, although we could say that all experts are stakeholders. What we mean is that a stakeholder is someone who has an interest in something. They might be affected somehow by an intervention or a study, but they might not necessarily have a specific kind of knowledge that's useful for the project. An expert is someone who does have that knowledge. So it could be a scientist, but it could also be, let's say, a fisher in the example of marine litter that has experienced many times, I don't know, that case that we had a few years ago with the whale with all that plastic in their stomach, in its stomach. So that's people who have hands-on experience might have expertise that scientists don't have, and that's what we call practice experts. And then, of course, there's this question of scientists as one type of expert, but other types of expertise that not necessarily scientific, that can be useful in a research project and in many other contexts. And the third consideration is the fact that, well, we have science-driven and we have what we call context-driven initiatives. And the difference here is that science-driven has as the primary, perhaps, objective to gain knowledge on a specific problem. And context-driven have a more intervention ambition. They want to solve something. Of course, these overlap a lot, but when we're talking about a research project, let's say that a university or a research institute has applied for and is coordinating, very often they want to address a specific knowledge gap, and they are reaching out to other types of experts in a co-production design to solve that problem. And then, of course, there can be implications for practice and for policy, but we focused in our paper on these specific collaborations between scientists and across science and practice. Just to give an example of these issues and different types of stakeholder engagement. When we talk about co-production, especially in the normative perspective, people might think the more the merrier, but it's not necessarily the case. People can collaborate in different perspectives. So we divide in this picture, in this illustration, different functions in evidence-based decision-making, but also in research process. So you have, well, in the figure, we have data collection, assessment, advice, and management. But you can think, for instance, on problem formulation, identification of hypotheses and research questions, and data collection, data analysis, different types of functions. And different stakeholders can be included or excluded or included in different degrees in different functions. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to collaborate in all functions at all times, but they might be particularly well suited, for instance, for identifying a specific research problem, but not so much for managing it. So the point of this figure is just to show that it's important to consider these things on a case-by-case basis, and to be explicit on what kind of collaboration and what type of stakeholder and what type of expert you want and in which phase of your project. So now that I've given you this introduction, I want to go to our 5 guidance points and things that we discuss in our paper. Yeah, the first thing is we advise research leaders to unite diverse participants through a shared objective and to manage divergent motivations. We know, of course, that people have different drivers. So, for instance, we have the archetypical idea that scientists are interested in publication, and experts, practice experts, NGOs, they are interested in interventions. And that can be a good place to start. But it's not the only thing, because people might have motivations across these perspectives. But if you're going to be pragmatic, of course, a project's objective is often very strongly connected to what the call for projects dictates and what we write in a proposal. But when we are going to implement that proposal, we need to reconsider. And I don't mean to rewrite it, but just to think how different participants relate to what we state as the goal and the goal of the project and the research questions. Because often these calls are very top down, but we need to find a way to count our own angle in these official goal statements, right? And I think it's especially useful to be mindful, not only of your own angle on this, but of the other participants. But especially for the project leader, it's important to be aware of this so that you can ensure a good flow of communication and a good, of course, also trust within the participants. So some just questions like, well, what's in it for me and what's in it for the others? What kind of incentives drives its set of participants? Why are they a part of the project? What do they have to gain from it? What do they have to contribute? And in that exercise, of course, it's useful to be as concrete as possible so that you can be meaningful, but as comprehensive as needed, of course, to be so that everyone can recognize, even though they come from different backgrounds and have different interests. An important thing is just to be mindful that people might use the same words but mean slightly different things. And I have just an example. That's not exactly a project, but we were revising the strategy of Nordland Research Institute last year. And we had just a debate because I had suggested that we wrote something about natural resources. And one of my colleagues said that she didn't agree with it. She wanted to use nature, not natural resource. And that might seem a very small difference, but that communicates that I'm a business economist by training and she's a social geographer. So she didn't want to see nature as a resource. And I hadn't thought about it like that. But that surprised me, and I thought it was just interesting to see, because just the very choice of word brings a whole lot of baggage of where you're coming from and what you want to do on something. Another example is when people use adjectives to describe something. This is simple, this is complex, this is short term, this is long term. And I had a conversation, I participated in a webinar last week where a consultant was talking about a project, and I had a question about the methodology, and I asked more about the methods, and he said, well, this was a long-term project. And as he spoke, I got to understand that it was a one-year project, which for a research institute is a short-term project, sort of. When we apply for 5 years or 10 years, if we can get a center, for instance, that's a long-term project. But in the everyday life of a consultancy company, a one-year project is a long-term project. So it's important to just understand where people are coming from. Other terms that can be confused by people from different backgrounds is, I already mentioned, nature and natural, but also what is innovation, what is technology, what is method, what is hypothesis, what is empirical. These are often taken for granted by scientists, but people might have more nuanced or specific things that they might, specific vocabularies that they might use, so it's slightly different. Yeah, so of course, if you're purposeful about understanding these different motivations, the communication flow can be much better in the project. And that's the first of our recommendations. Just unite diverse participants through a shared objective and manage divergent motivations. The second one has to do with consensus. And we noticed by reactions of colleagues and in social media that this one struck a nerve in our paper, because consensus is an elusive target. So if you expect that by cooperating with diverse stakeholders, there will be enthusiastic agreement, there's a high chance that you'll be disappointed. Precisely because if you hold consensus as the holy grail, consensus is very difficult to achieve, especially when people have conflicts that are not just about a fact, but of values, which is the case in post-normal problems. So the risk of insisting in consensus is that you can only agree on very shallow minimum denominator points, or that you hide what is a conflict, or that all agreements are just temporary. And of course, if people who participate don't feel that they have explored an issue in enough depth, but the rhetoric around the topic is that there was consensus, that can lead to disappointment, and people might feel as if they have wasted their time. And the issue of consensus is, of course, related. It's like the flip side of knowledge-based advice giving or knowledge-based management and policy, because it's always this idea that, well, if something is controversial, it's perhaps because we don't know enough, so let's do more and more and more research. But we have to acknowledge that lots of times these disagreements are because of what ethical and political underpinnings people have on specific issues, and that they are driven by values and not by facts. And we thought a lot about this one in writing the paper, and we cannot come up with a one-size-fits-all policy to how to deal with it. But of course, the key is just to promote tolerance for respectful disagreement and empathy. It's important to be transparent. Of course, if you aim for a manageable conflict, it's not that appealing. Everyone wants to be able to say, well, we reached a consensus, but manageable conflict is also feasible. And it could help this transparency to de-escalate specific conflicts. And yeah, I've been thinking about an example I could give you, and it's not that easy to come up with an example where consensus was not the target, because very often the discourse around the collaboration is that everyone will be happy, although that's very difficult in practice. But it's a bit more easy to give an example of a situation in which consensus was held as the Holy Grail, but people felt perhaps disappointed. We mentioned this briefly in our paper, but you're perhaps familiar with this controversy on oil exploration in Lofoten Islands, right? And at the time that it was not yet certain that there would be no oil, this was very controversial. But then there were these community meetings, and they were just revising the management plan for the region. And people were invited to give their opinions. But the whole discourse around it was very much like, well, we have the practice advice and we have the public opinion, in a way that put one as more important than the other. And at the same time, all these people saying you have to make knowledge-based decisions. And that was Brigt, my co-author. He did a field work in the topic at the time. And he has another publication where he explains this in more detail, but he has a quote that one of the participants said that they felt they didn't have any room to say what they meant, because it was already clear that it was the experts who would be listened to. So that was disappointing for them. We all know how that turned out, that we do not have oil exploitation in Lofoten. But still, that community engagement at the time, many participants experienced it as frustrating, because especially the final reports had all these sayings that this was consensus, but people didn't really, not everyone felt that they were represented in this. Just another example is this issue of societal readiness. If you read some EU calls for Horizon Europe, for instance, especially in technology development, they will say they want to assess the societal readiness. And some people might experience this as, well, they've decided this technology is a good idea, and now we just have to assess how ready people are. But if that's the case, then to what extent do people have room for questioning the premises in the first place? So that's one reason why, yeah, consensus can be very challenging, and perhaps it's more realistic to not hold it as the Holy Grail, as the all or nothing for success. The third issue we discuss in the paper is the issue of different types of expertise. People have to understand and appreciate the different types of experts that participate in a collaborative project, in a co-production project, right? Because diversity of backgrounds is not really a barrier for cohesiveness, but pretending they're not there can create problems. This is an exercise, of course, for all participants, but especially for the project leader. To just promote that people think, what do the other participants know that I do not know? What can they do that I cannot do? And why does that matter in light of the project objective that we've developed together? And yeah, I mentioned earlier the distinction between expert and a stakeholder. There are other very legitimate ways to participate that a stakeholder doesn't have to be an expert, but it's important to just be clear about it and not misuse the word co-production. Co-production is when a specific participant has a real power to influence the direction of what a project is doing. If they don't have a real power to direct it, then you can call them a stakeholder, but let's try to be mindful of how we use co-production so as not to make it a banal expression. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that there are power imbalances and differences in status, both between like a scientist and a practice experts, but also among academic disciplines. Some have higher status than others, as we have experienced. But it's important that to create an environment of trust, that all participants' worth and authority are in equal footing so that they can really co-produce. And this is where these more soft skills, leadership and management skills, can be useful, but also challenging, because many scientists, or most scientists, are not trained in these types of skills. So two things that are important to think about here is, for instance, how do you deal with hypotheses from practice experts that turn out to be unsupported? Let's say that you are collaborating with fishers, or we have another example in the paper about shrimp fishers, where they had this hypothesis that it was the sea lice chemicals from aquaculture that were causing the death of shrimp populations in a specific area in northern Norway. But that was a hypothesis, right? And it turned out to be supported in this example, but let's say it hadn't been supported. Then you invited those people to collaborate, and many people might identify very strongly with being a practice expert, or because of the type of knowledge that they bring to the table. So it's a very challenging skill to have for the project leader, to treat people respectfully, but also holding the evidence-based standards, right? And yeah, the same goes for work with indigenous people that have this traditional knowledge, but it can be difficult to codify and to test in scientific terms. This is a skill for project leaders and all people participating in co-production projects, and how to engage with people from different backgrounds, and in a respectful way, but also in a way that upholds the idea of that all knowledge can and should be questioned. Failure to explicitly address the fact that people have distinct types of expertise can just lead to miscommunication, misunderstandings, and the creation of dysfunctional hierarchies. And at worst, just paying lip service to stakeholder engagement. And that's what we don't want. We want meaningful and not lip service stakeholder engagement. Yeah. Then we have the fourth aspect, which has to do with the struggles in sharing preliminary work and potentially harmful information. This paradigm of post-normal science, it disrupts an apparent linearity of knowledge production, right? Everyone who's a scientist, or who has been who has taken a PhD, knows that it's not that linear. You don't just go from a research question, hypothesis, data collection, data analysis, and then you publish. And that's not just how it is. It's a very iterative process. But this happens internally in academia, or behind closed doors towards the general public. But when we're co-producing, you have to collaborate with others that are not scientists, although within the project team. But people might be uncomfortable sometimes sharing things that they perceive are not tested, or that are not completely mature thoughts, or that can be very, very difficult, because scientists are, of course, inviting actors who didn't have access to this backstage of knowledge production and science in the making. We do collaborate a lot and share untested, unfinished work in conferences. But the difference is that in a conference, you're discussing with someone else who knows your field and who knows how to deal with the uncertainty of the statements that you're making. But in a co-production context, there's a very uneven baseline for knowledge sharing, and people are afraid that they might be misinterpreted or that the information that they're putting out there could be misused, because in that case, they will lose control of the narratives that derive from their work, and it can be a threat to their impartiality. But practice experts can also be vulnerable. They might be in a position to share or decide not to share information that might harm them. And yeah, one example is, of course, fishers and fishing quotas. If you're going to interview fishers and they're going to give you true information, they might tell you something that it's either unethical or even illegal. And that can be difficult. So if you don't have an environment of trust in the project team, you will not get access to that kind of information that's essential to your research. You have also this observer effect, and the fact that people, when they're observed, behave slightly different according to what they want to signal. And they might be just performing. And you have this expression here, para inglês ver, from Portuguese, which is my native tongue, which literally means for the English to see. And that comes from the 19th century with the slave trade and the fact that Brazil was being pressured to end the slave trade, but they just did it enough for the English to see, but they didn't really change it. So that's what we don't want. We don't want to do things for the English to see. We want to change things for real. Just reminding people to share is not sufficient if you don't give them strong enough motivation and if you don't have enough trust across the participants. And all these previous steps that I mentioned, the fact that you should foster an environment where people understand and appreciate the expertise of others, all that is important for trust and for being able to share things. If you don't do that, people will just cherry pick what they share and what they hold back. And at best, that's just a missed opportunity, but at worst, it can threaten the validity of what you're trying to do. And well, that was internally in the project team, but you also have an external perspective on how the project team communicates with other stakeholders outside the project, right? And scientists have a very strong wish to convey neutrality in politically charged territory, and this must be addressed by the project leader. Taking a very public position on something that's uncertain or disputed can be threatening to scientists' reputation, to their credibility, and to the authority of science in general, not just that specific scientist. And that's already under threat in some circles. We all know all about fake news and alternative facts and all these things that were not that prominent, not that long ago, but that now are really prominent, and people want to be very careful about it. No one wants to be very public about something that turns out to be wrong afterwards, but that's just how debate has to happen. So how do we deal with this? Well, one way is just to be respectful of, well, we all know that scientists make all of these caveats and qualifications about what they're saying, but media and practice wants the substance of what you have found. Well, cut the method. I don't want to know about the method. I want to know what you found and what I should do. And scientists want to say, well, yes, this is true, but given that circumstance and in these conditions, and if you do this and that, then I can say, but that's a very conflicting position. If you read like advice on how to write a chronique, an op-ed in a newspaper for national circulation, they'll say, just go to the point. But it can be difficult when you want to be very clear on what qualifications that statement has. And this is, of course, a demand from scientists, but it's also expected of them. In one workshop we had, one NGO, one person representing an NGO said that for them, it would just be catastrophic to have an alliance with a scientist who was thought to have an agenda. Scientists, one of the important values that scientists bring to the table is the fact that they are perceived as impartial or neutral. So that's very tricky and very difficult because, of course, people, everyone has biases, and being transparent about them is important to not allow them to affect what you're doing. But at the same time, navigating these controversies is very difficult. So the important thing here is to just allow space for people to be cautious, but at the same time encourage them to engage with the social political implications of the work that they're doing. Well, these were our five points in the paper. We also have a session where we discuss the point of social sciences and the humanities, but I don't know if I've already talked too much, or Elena.
Just go on, go on. It's very interesting. I think you could finish.
Well, this has to do with the fact that all three of us are co-authors of this paper. We are social scientists, and we are based our thoughts in this paper on collaboration with other types of scientists. And a lot of the times, they might not really understand what it is that we do, or might have some expectations of what we should do in a co-production process. And of course, we can and we do coordinate the engagement between practice experts and scientists, but that's just a small thing of what we can and should be able to do in these projects, right? If we think that this collaboration can achieve these three things you can see in the figure, right? Credibility, legitimacy, and salience. The social sciences are the intangible connections between all of these things, right? Scientists are very concerned with credibility. Practice experts are extremely concerned with legitimacy. Everyone is concerned with the salience. And social scientists, they can connect these three things through social impact, which is where you connect legitimacy and credibility, policy impact, where you connect credibility with salience, and a context-grounded perspective where you connect salience with the legitimacy. And social sciences are very diverse. Anthropology is a social science, and economics is also a social science, and not to mention the humanities, which can also contribute with a lot of these issues. But it's an intangible type of contribution. We can create space for critical reflection. We can ask big picture questions. But we need, I'm not going to read the entire list, you can see that, but the point is that it's intangible, but that we also need space and resources in a project to ask social science questions, and not just to facilitate communication between different stakeholders. And I think it's extremely important as co-production becomes more and more requested by research funders, that we do have room for critical social sciences research in these types of contexts. Yeah, because after all, these social, political, and economic implications, they're not just a bother, they are integral to the knowledge production process. And it's important that we are allowed, we have room to investigate them. Yeah, so this is just a summary of the 5 points that I presented to you, and thank you very much. And I'm open to questions if you have any. Thank you.